Five Nights at Freddy's. The Twisted Ones. Chapter 1. Don't Trust Your Eyes. Dr. Treadwell walked back and forth across the platform at the front of the auditorium. Her steps were slow and even, almost hypnotic. Your eyes deceive you every day, filling in the blanks for you in a world of sensory overload. An image of dizzying geometric detail lit up the canvas screen behind her. When I say sensory overload, I mean that quite literally. At every moment, your senses are receiving far more information than they can process all at once, and your mind is forced to choose which signals to pay attention to. It does that based on your experiences and your expectation of what is normal. The things we are familiar with are the things we can, for the most part, ignore. We can see this most easily with olfactory fatigue. Your nose ceases to perceive a smell when you've been around it for a while. You may be quite thankful for this phenomenon, depending on the habits of your roommate. The class tittered dutifully, then became quiet as the image of another multicolored design flashed onto the screen. The professor gave a hint of a smile and continued. Your mind creates motion when there is none. It fills in colors and trajectories based on what you've seen before, and calculates what you should be seeing now. Another image flashed onto the overhead screen. If your mind didn't do this, then simply walking outside and seeing a tree would consume all your mental energy, leaving no resources to do anything else. In order for you to function in the world, your mind fills in the spaces of that tree with its own leaves and branches. 100 pencils scribbled all at once, filling the lecture hall with a sound like scurrying mice. It's why, when you enter a house for the first time, you experience a moment of dizziness. Your mind is taking in more than usual. It's drawing a floor plan, creating a palette of colors, and saving an inventory of images to draw on later, so you don't have to go through that exhausting intake every single time. The next time you enter that same house, you'll already know where you are. Charlie! An urgent voice whispered her name, inches from her ear. Charlie kept writing. She was staring straight ahead at the display at the front of the lecture hall. As Dr. Treadwell went on, she paced faster, occasionally flinging an arm toward the screen to illustrate her point. Her words seemed to be falling behind as her mind raced on ahead. Charlie had realized, by the second day of classes, that her professor sometimes broke off in the middle of one sentence, only to finish an entirely different one. It was like she skimmed the text in her head, reading out a few words here and there. Most of the students in her robotics class found it maddening, but Charlie liked it. It made the lesson kind of like doing a puzzle. The screen flashed again, displaying an assortment of mechanical parts and the diagram of an eye. This is what you must recreate. Dr. Treadwell stepped back from the image, turning to look at it with the class. Basic artificial intelligence is all about sensory control. You won't be dealing with a mind that can filter these things out for itself. You must design programs that recognize basic shapes, while discarding unimportant information. You must do for your robot what your own mind does for you. Create a simplified and organized assembly of information based on what's relevant. Let's start by looking at some examples of basic shape recognition. Charlie! Hissed the voice again, and she waved her pencil impatiently at the figure peering over her shoulder. Her friend, Arty, trying to shoo him away. The gesture cost her a moment, put her half a step behind the professor. She hurried to catch up, anxious not to miss a single line. The paper in front of her was covered in formulas, notes in the margins, sketches, and diagrams. She wanted to get everything down all at once, not just the math, but all the things it made her think of. If she could tie the new facts to things she already knew, she'd retain it much more easily. She felt hungry for it, alert, watching for new tidbits of information like a dog under the dinner table. A boy near the front raised his hand to ask a question, and Charlie felt a brief flare of impatience. Now the whole class would have to stop while Treadwell went back to explain a simple concept. Charlie let her mind wander, sketching absently in the margins of her notebook. John would be here in... She glanced restlessly at her watch. An hour. I told him maybe someday we'll see each other again. I guess it's someday. He had called out of the blue. I'm just going to be passing through, he said, and Charlie hadn't bothered to ask how he knew where she was. Of course he would know. There was no reason not to meet him, and she found herself alternately excited and filled with dread. Now, as she absently sketched rectangular forms along the bottom of her notepaper, her stomach jumped, a little spasm of nerves. It felt like a lifetime since she last saw him. Sometimes it felt like she'd seen him yesterday, as if the last year hadn't passed. But of course it had, and everything had changed for Charlie once again. That May, the night of her 18th birthday, the dreams had begun. Charlie was long accustomed to nightmares, the worst moments of her past forced up like bile, into twisted versions of memories already too terrible to recall. She shoved these dreams into the back of her mind in the morning and sealed them away, knowing they would only breach it when night fell again. These dreams were different. When she woke, she was physically exhausted, not just drained but sore, her muscles weak. Her hands were stiff and aching, like they'd been clenched into fists for hours. These new dreams didn't come every night, but when they did, they interrupted her regular nightmares and took them over. It didn't matter if she was running and screaming for her life, or wandering aimlessly through a dull mishmash of the various places she'd been all week. Suddenly, from nowhere, she would sense him. Sammy, her lost twin brother, was near. She knew he was present, the same way she knew that she was present. And whatever the dream was, it dropped away. People, places, light, and sound. Now she was searching for him in the darkness, calling his name. He never answered. She would drop to her hands and knees, feeling her way through the dark, letting her presence guide her until she came to a barrier. It was smooth and cold, metal. She couldn't see it, but she hit it hard with one fist, and it echoed. "Sammy!" she would call, hitting harder. She stood, reaching up to see if she could scale the slick surface, but it stretched up far above her head. She beat her fists against the barricade until they hurt. She screamed her brother's name until her throat was raw, until she fell to the floor and leaned on the solid metal, pressing her cheek to its cool surface and hoping for a whisper from the other side. He was there. She knew it as surely as if he were a part of herself. She knew in those dreams that he was present. Worse, when she was awake, she knew he was not there. In August, Charlie and Aunt Jen had their first fight. They'd always been too distant to really argue. Charlie never felt the need to rebel, because Jen provided no real authority, and Jen never took anything Charlie did personally, never tried to stop her from doing anything, as long as she was safe. The day Charlie moved in with her, at the age of 7, Aunt Jen had told her plainly that she was not a replacement for Charlie's parents. By now, Charlie was old enough to understand that Jen had meant it as a gesture of respect, a way to reassure Charlie that her father wouldn't be forgotten, that she would always be his child, but at the time it had seemed like an admonishment. Don't expect parenting. Don't expect love. And so Charlie hadn't. Jen had never failed to care for Charlie. Charlie had never wanted for food or clothing, and Jen had taught her to cook, to take care of the house, to manage her money, and to fix your own car. You have to be independent, Charlie. You have to know how to take care of yourself. You have to be stronger than—" She'd cut herself off, but Charlie knew how the sentence ended. "Then your father—" Charlie shook her head, trying to jerk herself free of her own thoughts. "What's wrong?" Arty said next to her. "Nothing," she whispered. She ran her pencil again and again over the same lines, up, over, down, over, the graphite wearing thicker and thicker. Charlie had told Jen that she was going back to Hurricane, and Jen's face turned stony, her skin paling. "Why would you want to do that?" she asked, with a dangerous calm in her voice. Charlie's heart beat faster. "Because that's where I lost him. Because I need him more than I need you." The thought of returning had been nagging at her for months, growing stronger with each passing week. One morning, she awoke, and the choice was made. Final. Sitting in her mind with a solid weight. "Jessica's going to college at St. George," she told her aunt. "She's starting in the summer semester, so I can stay with her while I'm there. I want to see the house again. There's still so much I don't understand. It just feels important." She finished weakly, faltering, as Jen's eyes, dark blue, like marble, fixed on her. Jen didn't answer for a long moment. Then she said simply, "No." "Why not?" Charlie might once have said, "You let me go before." But after what happened last year, when she and Jessica and the others went back to Freddy's and discovered the horrifying truth behind the murders at her father's old pizzeria, things had changed between them. Charlie had changed. Now she met Jen's gaze, determined. "I'm going," she said, trying to keep her own voice steady. Then everything exploded. Charlie didn't know which of them started shouting first, but she screamed until her throat was fiery and sore, hurling at her aunt every pain she'd ever inflicted, every hurt she'd failed to prevent. Jen shouted back that she only ever meant to care for Charlie, that she had always done her best, flinging reassuring words that somehow dripped with poison. "I'm leaving!" Charlie screamed with finality. She started for the door, but Jen grabbed her arm, yanking her violently back. Charlie stumbled, almost falling before she caught herself on the kitchen table, and Jen let her hand drop with a shocked expression. There was silence, and then Charlie left. She packed a bag, feeling as if she had somehow diverged from reality, into an impossible parallel world. Then she got in her car and drove away. She didn't tell anyone she was going. Her friends here were not close friends. There was no one she owed an explanation. When Charlie got to Hurricane, she'd intended to go straight to her father's house, to stay there for the next few days until Jessica arrived on campus. But as she reached the city limits, something stopped her. "I can't," she thought. "I can't ever go back." She turned the car around, drove straight to St. George, and slept in her car for a week. It was only after Charlie knocked and Jessica opened the door with a startled expression that Charlie realized that she never actually mentioned her plans to Jessica, on whom they'd all depended. She told her everything, and Jessica hesitantly offered to let her stay. Charlie had slept on the floor the rest of the summer, and as the fall semester approached, Jessica didn't ask her to leave. "It's nice to have someone who knows me here," she had said, and uncharacteristically, Charlie hugged her. Charlie had never cared about high school. She never paid much attention in her classes, but A's and B's came easily for her. She never really thought about liking or disliking her subjects, though sometimes one teacher or another would make her feel a spark of interest for a year. Charlie hadn't thought much beyond the end of the summer, but as she idly flipped through Jessica's course catalog and saw advanced courses in robotics, something clicked into place. St. George was among the colleges she'd been accepted into earlier that year, though she hadn't really intended to go to any of them. Now, however, she went to the administrative office and pleaded her case until she was allowed to enroll, despite having missed the deadline by months. There's still so much I don't understand. Charlie wanted to learn, and the things she wanted to learn were very specific. Of course, there were things she had to learn before a robotics course would make any sense at all. Math had always been straightforward, functional, sort of like a game to Charlie. You did the right thing you were supposed to do and got the answer. But it had never been a very interesting game. It was fun to learn something new, but then you have to keep doing it for weeks or months, bored out of your skull. That was high school. But in her first calculus class, something had happened. It was as if she'd been laying bricks for years, forced to work slowly, seeing nothing but her mortar and her trowel. Then suddenly, someone pulled her back a few steps and said, "Here, look, you've been building this castle. Go play inside." "And that's all for today," Professor Treadwell said at last. Charlie looked down at her paper, realizing she never stopped moving her pencil. She had worn dark lines right through the page, and drawn on the desk. She rubbed the marks half-heartedly with her sleeve, then opened her binder to put away her notes. Arty poked her head over the shoulder, and she closed it hastily, but he had already gotten a good look. What was that? A secret code? Abstract art? "It's just math," Charlie said, a little curtly, and put the notebook in her bag. Arty was cute in a goofy way. He had a pleasant face, dark eyes, and curly brown hair that seemed to have a life of its own. He was in 3 of her 4 classes, and had been following her since the beginning of the semester, like a stray duckling. To her surprise, Charlie found that she didn't mind it. As Charlie left the auditorium, Arty took up his now accustomed place at her side. "So, did you decide about the project?" he asked. Project? Charlie vaguely remembered something about a project he wanted to do together. He gave a little nod, waiting for her to catch up. "Remember? We have to design an experiment for chem. I thought we could work together, you know, with your brains and my looks." He trailed off, grinning. "Yeah, that sounds... I have to go meet someone." She interrupted herself. "You never meet anyone," he said, surprised, blushing bright red as soon as the words were out of his mouth. "I didn't mean it that way. Not that it's any of my business, but who is it?" He gave a broad smile. "John," Charlie said, without elaboration. Arty looked crestfallen for a moment, but recovered quickly. "Of course, yeah! John. Great guy," he said teasingly. He raised his eyebrows, prompting for details, but she gave none. "I didn't know that you had a... That's cool." Arty's face took on a look of careful neutrality. Charlie looked at him oddly. She hadn't meant to imply that she and John were a couple, but she didn't know how to correct him. She couldn't explain who John was to her without telling Arty far more than she wanted him to know. They walked in silence for a minute across the main quad, a small, grassy square surrounded by brick and concrete buildings. "So, is John from your hometown?" Arty asked at last. "My hometown is 30 minutes away. This place is basically just an extension of it," Charlie said. "But yeah, he's from Hurricane." Arty hesitated, then leaned in closer to her, glancing around as if someone might be listening. "I always meant to ask you," he said. Charlie looked at him warily. "Don't ask about it." "I'm sure people ask you about it all the time, but come on, you can't blame me for being curious. That stuff about the murders, it's like an urban legend around here. I mean, not just around here, everywhere. Freddy Fazbear's Pizza." "Stop." Charlie's face was suddenly immobile. She felt as if moving it, making any expression at all, would require an arcane skill she no longer possessed. Arty's face had changed too. His easy smile drained away. He looked almost frightened. Charlie bit the inside of her lip, willing her mouth to move. "I was just a kid when it all happened," she said quietly. Arty nodded, quick and skittish. Charlie made her face move into a smile. "I have to go meet Jessica," she lied. "I have to get away from you." Arty nodded his head again, like a bobblehead doll. She turned and walked away toward the dorm, not looking back. Charlie blinked into the sunlight. Flashes of what happened last year at Freddy's were batting at her, snatches of memory plucking at her clothing with cold iron fingers. The hook above, poised to strike, no escape. A figure looming behind the stage, red matted fur barely concealing the metal bones of the murderous creature. Kneeling in pitch dark on the cold tile floor of the bathroom, and then that giant hard plastic eye glaring through the crack, the hot miasmy of lifeless breath on her face. And the other, older memory, the thought that made her ache in ways for which she had no words. Sorrow filling her as if it had been wrought into her very bones. She and Sammy, her other self, her twin brother, were playing their quiet games in the familiar warmth of the costume closet. Then the figure appeared in the doorway, looking down on them. Then Sammy was gone, and the world ended for the first time. Charlie was standing outside her own dorm room, almost without knowing how she'd gotten there. Slowly, she pulled her keys from her pocket and let herself into the room. The lights were off. Jessica was still in class. Charlie shut the door behind her, checking the lock twice, and leaned back against it. She took a deep breath. It's over now. She straightened decisively and snapped on the overhead light, filling the room with a harsh illumination. The clock beside the bed told Charlie that she still had a little under an hour before John arrived. Time to work on her project. Charlie and Jessica had divided the room with a piece of masking tape after their first week living together. Jessica suggested it jokingly. She said she'd seen it in a movie, but Charlie had grinned and helped her measure the room. She knew Jessica was desperate to keep Charlie's mess off her side. The result was a bedroom that looked like a before and after picture, advertising either a cleaning service or a nuclear weapon, depending on whose side you looked at first. On Charlie's desk, there was a pillowcase, draped over two indistinct shapes. She went to her desk and removed it, folding it carefully and placing it on her chair. She looked at her project. "Hello," she said softly. Two mechanical faces were held upright on metal structures and attached to a length of board. Their features were indistinct, like old statues worn away by rain or new clay not yet fully sculpted. They were made of a malleable plastic, and where the backs of their heads ought to be, they were instead networks of casings, microchips, and wires. Charlie bent down toward them, looking over every millimeter of her design, making sure everything was as she'd left it. She flipped a small black switch, and little lights blinked. Tiny cooling fans began to whir. They didn't move right away, but there was a change. The vague features took on a sense of purpose. Their blind eyes didn't turn to Charlie. They looked only at each other. "You," said the first. Its lips moved to shape the syllable, but never parted. They weren't made to open. "I," the second replied, making the same soft, constrained movement. "You are," said the first. "Am I?" said the second. Charlie watched, her hand pressed over her mouth. She held her breath, afraid of disturbing them. She waited, but they had apparently finished, and were now simply looking at each other. "They can't see," Charlie reminded herself. She turned them off and pulled the board around so that she could peer into their backs. She reached inside and adjusted a wire. A key slid into the lock of the door, and Charlie startled at the sound. She snatched the pillowcase and threw it over the faces as Jessica entered the room. Jessica paused in the doorway with a grin. "What was that?" she asked. "What?" Charlie said innocently. "Come on. I know you were working on that thing you never let me see." She dropped her backpack on the floor, then flopped dramatically back on the bed. "Anyways, I'm exhausted," she announced. Charlie laughed, and Jessica sat up. "Come talk to me," she said. "What's up with you and John?" Charlie sat down on her bed, across from Jessica. Despite their different lifestyles, she liked living with the other girl. Jessica was warm and bright, And while her ease as she went about the world still intimidated Charlie a little, now she felt like a part of it. Maybe being Jessica's friend meant absorbing some of her confidence. I haven't seen him yet. I had to leave in... She peered over Jessica's shoulder at the clock. 15 minutes. Are you excited? Jessica said. Charlie shrugged. I think so, she said. Jessica laughed. You're not sure? I'm excited, Charlie admitted. It's just been a long time. Not that long, Jessica pointed out. I guess it sort of has been, though. Everything is so different since the last time we saw him. Charlie cleared her throat. So you really want to see my project? She asked, surprising herself. Yes! Jessica declared, springing up from the bed. She followed Charlie to her desk. Charlie switched on the power, then flung off the pillowcase like a magician. Jessica gasped and took an involuntary step back. What is it? She asked, her voice cautious. But before Charlie could answer, the first face spoke. Me, it said. You, the other replied, and they both fell silent again. Charlie looked at Jessica. Her friend had a pinched expression, like she was holding something tightly inside. I, the second face said. Charlie hurried to switch them off. Why do you have that look on your face? She said. Jessica took a deep breath and smiled at her. I just haven't had lunch yet, she said, but something lingered in her eyes. Jessica watched as Charlie replaced the pillowcase lovingly over the faces, as if she were tucking a child into bed. She looked uncomfortably around the room. Charlie's half was a disaster. Clothes and books were strewn everywhere, but there were also the wires and computer parts, tools, screws, and pieces of plastic and metal Jessica didn't recognize, all jumbled up together. It wasn't just a mess. It was a chaotic tangle where you could lose anything, or hide anything, she realized, with a pang of guilt at the thought. Jessica turned her attention back to Charlie. What are you programming them to do? She asked, and Charlie smiled proudly. I'm not exactly programming them to do anything. I'm helping them learn on their own. Right, of course. Obviously, Jessica said slowly. As she did, something caught her eye. A pair of shiny plastic eyes and long floppy ears were peering out from a pile of dirty laundry. Hey, I never noticed you brought Theodore, your little robo-rabbit, she exclaimed, pleased to have remembered the name of Charlie's childhood toy. Before Charlie could respond, she picked the stuffed animal up by his ears and came away with only his head. Jessica let out a shriek and dropped it, clapping a hand over her mouth. I'm sorry, Charlie said, hastily grabbing the rabbit's head off the floor. I took him apart to study. I'm using some of his parts in my project. She gestured at the thing on her desk. Oh, Jessica said, trying to hide her dismay. She glanced around the room and suddenly realized that the rabbit's parts were everywhere. His cotton ball tail was on Charlie's pillow, and a leg hung off the lamp above her desk. His torso lay in the corner, almost out of sight, ripped open savagely. Jessica looked at her friend's round, cheerful face and frizzy, shoulder-length brown hair. Jessica closed her eyes for a long moment. Oh, Charlie, what's wrong with you? Jessica? Charlie said. The girl's eyes were closed, her expression pained. Jessica? This time, she opened her eyes and gave Charlie a sudden bright smile, turning on cheer like a faucet. It was disconcerting, but Charlie had gotten used to it. Jessica blinked hard, like she was resetting her brain. So, are you nervous about seeing John? She asked. Charlie thought for a moment. No, I mean, why should I be? It's just John, right? Charlie tried to laugh, but gave up. Jessica, I don't know what to talk about. She burst out suddenly. What do you mean? I don't know what to talk about with him, Charlie said. If we don't have something to talk about, then we'll start talking about what happened last year, and I just can't. Right. Jessica looked thoughtful. Maybe he won't bring it up, she offered. Charlie sighed, glancing back at her covered experiment with longing. Of course he will. It's all we have in common. She sat down heavily on her bed and slumped over. Charlie, you don't have to talk about anything you don't want to talk about, Jessica said gently. You can always just cancel on him. but I don't think John's going to put you on the spot. He cares about you. I doubt what happened in the hurricane is what's on his mind. What does that mean? I just mean, Jessica gingerly pushed aside a pile of laundry and sat next to Charlie, placing a hand on her knee. I just mean that maybe it's time that you both move past that. And I think John is trying to. Charlie looked away and stared fixedly at Theodore's head, face down on the floor. You mean get over it? How do I even begin? Jessica's voice softened. This can't be your whole life anymore. I know. Charlie sighed. She decided to change the subject. How was your class anyway? Charlie wiped her eyes, hoping Jessica would take the hint. Awesome! Jessica stood and stretched, bending over to touch her toes, and incidentally giving Charlie a chance to compose herself. When Jessica stood again, she was smiling brilliantly, back in character. Did you know that corpses can be preserved in pea bogs like mummies? Charlie wrinkled her nose. I do now. So is that what you're going to do when you graduate? Crawl around in peat bogs looking for bodies? Jessica shrugged. Maybe. I'll get you a hazmat suit for your graduation gift. Charlie joked. She looked at her watch. Time to go. Wish me luck. She brushed her hair back with her hands, peering into the mirror that hung on the back of the door. I feel like a mess. You look great. Jessica gave her an encouraging nod. I've been doing sit-ups, Charlie said awkwardly. Huh? Forget it. Charlie grabbed her backpack and headed for the door. Go knock his socks off, Jessica called as Charlie left. I don't know what that means, Charlie replied, letting the door swing closed before she'd finished speaking. Charlie spotted him as she approached the main entrance to the campus. John was leaning on the wall, reading a book. His brown hair was as messy as ever, and he was wearing a blue t-shirt and jeans, dressed more casually than the last time she'd seen him. John! She called, her reluctance falling away as soon as she saw him. He put away his book, grinning widely, and hurried to her. Hey, Charlie, he said. They stood there awkwardly. Then Charlie extended her arms to hug him. He held her tightly for a moment, then abruptly released her. You got taller, she said accusingly, and he laughed. I did, he admitted. He gave her a searching look. You look exactly the same, though, he said, in a puzzled smile. I cut my hair, Charlie said, in mock outrage. She ran her fingers through it, demonstrating. Oh yeah, he said. I like it. I just mean you're the same girl I remember. I've been doing sit-ups, Charlie said, with a rising panic. Huh? John gave her a confused look. Never mind. Are you hungry? Charlie asked. I have about an hour before my next class. We could get a burger. There's a dining hall not far from here. Yeah, that would be great, John said. Charlie pointed across the quad. That way, come on. So what are you doing here? Charlie asked, as they sat down with their trays. Sorry, she added. Did that sound rude? Not rude at all. Although I would have also accepted John. To what circumstance do I owe the pleasure of this delightful reunion? Yeah, that sounds like me, Charlie said dryly. But seriously, what are you doing here? Got a job. In St. George? She asked. Why? In Hurricane, actually, he said, his voice self-consciously casual. Aren't you in school somewhere? Charlie asked. John blushed, looking down at his plate for a moment. I was going to, but it's a lot of money to read books when a library card is free, you know. My cousin got me a job in construction, and I'm working on my writing when I can. I figured, even if I'm going to be an artist, I don't have to be a starving one. He took an illustrative bite of his hamburger, and Charlie grinned. So I hear, she insisted, and he held up a finger as he finished chewing. The storm, he said. Charlie nodded. The storm had hit Hurricane before Charlie came to St. George, and people talked about it in capital letters. The storm. It wasn't the worst the area had ever seen, but it was close. A tornado had risen up from nowhere and ripped through whole towns, razing one house to the ground with sinister precision, while leaving the one next to it untouched. There hadn't been much damage in St. George, but Hurricane had seen real destruction. How bad is it? Charlie asked, keeping her tone light. You haven't been? John said, incredulously, and it was Charlie's turn to look awkwardly away. She shook her head. "It's bad in places," he said. "Mostly on the outskirts of town. Charlie, I assumed you'd been." He bit his lip. "What?" Something about his expression was worrying her. "Your dad's house. It was one of the ones that got hit," he said. "Oh." Something leaden was growing in Charlie's chest. "I didn't know. You really didn't even go back to check?" "I didn't think of it," Charlie said. "That's not true." She thought 1,000 times of going back to her father's house, but it had never occurred to her that the house might have been hit in a storm. In her mind, it was impregnable, unchanging. It would always be there, just as her father had left it. She closed her eyes and pictured it. The front steps sagged in disrepair, but the house itself stood like a fortress, protecting what was inside. "Is it gone?" Charlie asked, the words faint. "No," John said quickly. "No, it's still there, just damaged. I don't know how much. I just drove by. I didn't think I should go there without you." Charlie nodded, only half listening. She felt far away. She could see John, hear him, but there was a layer of something between them, between her and everything else, everything but the house itself. "I would have thought. Didn't your aunt tell you what happened?" John asked. "I have to get to class," Charlie said. "It's that way." She gestured vaguely. "Charlie, have you been okay?" She didn't look at him, and he placed his hand over hers. She still couldn't look up. She didn't want him to see her face. "Okay," she repeated, then slipped her hand out from under his and shrugged her shoulders up and down, like she was trying to get something off her back. "I had my birthday," she offered, and she finally leveled her gaze to meet his. "I'm sorry I missed it," John said. No, it's not." She tipped her head from side to side, as if she could level out her thoughts, too. "Do you remember how I had a twin?" "What?" John sounded puzzled. "Of course I do. I'm sorry, Charlie. Is that what you meant about your birthday?" She nodded, making tiny motions. John held out his hand again, and she took it. She could feel his pulse through his thumb. "Ever since we left Hurricane, you know how twins are supposed to be connected? Have some kind of special bond?" "Sure," he said. "Ever since we left, ever since I found out he was real, I felt like he was there with me. I know he's not. He's dead. But for that whole year, I didn't feel alone anymore. Charlie." John's hand tightened on hers. "You know you're not alone." "No, I mean really alone. Like I have another self. Someone who's a part of me and is always with me. I've had these feelings before, but they came and went, and I didn't pay much attention to them. I didn't know they meant something. Then when I learned the truth, and those memories started coming back to me, John, I felt whole in a way I don't even know how to describe." Her eyes began to fill with tears, and she pulled her hand back to brush them away. "Hey," he said softly. "It's okay." "That's great, Charlie. I'm glad you have that." No, that's the thing. I don't." She met his eyes, desperate for him to understand what she was so awkwardly trying to say. "He's disappeared. That sense of completeness is gone." "What?" "It happened on my birthday. I woke up and I just felt—" She sighed, searching. There wasn't a word for it. "Alone?" John said. "Incomplete." She took a breath, pulling herself back together. "But the thing is, it's not just lost. It's like he's trapped somewhere. I have these dreams where I can feel him on the other side of something. Like he's so close to me, but he's stuck somewhere. Like he's in a box. Or I'm in a box. I can't tell." John stared at her, momentarily speechless. Before he could figure out what to say, Charlie stood abruptly. "I need to leave." "Are you sure? You haven't even eaten," he said. "I'm sorry," she broke off. "John, it's so good to see you." She hesitated, then turned to walk away, possibly for good. She knew she disappointed him. "Charlie, would you like to go out with me tonight?" John's voice sounded stiff, but his eyes were warm. "Sure, that would be great," she said, giving a half smile. "Don't you have to get back to work tomorrow, though?" "It's only half an hour away," John said. He cleared his throat. "But I meant, do you want to go out with me?" "I just said yeah," Charlie repeated, slightly irritated. John sighed. "I mean, on a date, Charlie." Oh. Charlie stared at him for a moment. Right. You don't have to do anything you don't want to. Jessica's voice echoed in her head. And yet, she realized she was smiling. Yes. Yes, a date. Okay, yeah. There's a movie theater in town. She hazarded, vaguely recalling that movies were something people did on dates. John nodded vigorously, apparently as lost at sea as she was, now that the question had been asked. Can we have dinner first? There's that Thai place down the street. I can meet you there around 8? Yeah, sounds good. Bye. Charlie grabbed her backpack and hurried out the dining room door, realizing, as she stepped into the sunshine, that she left him to clean up their table alone. Sorry. As Charlie headed across the quad to her next class, her step grew more purposeful. This was a basic computer science class. Writing code wasn't as exciting as what Dr. Treadwell taught, but Charlie still liked it. It was absorbing, detailed work. A single error could ruin everything. Everything? She thought of her impending date. The idea that a single error could ruin everything suddenly carried an awful weight. Charlie hurried up the steps to the building and stopped short as a man blocked her path. It was Clay Burke. Hey, Charlie, he smiled, but his eyes were grave. Charlie hadn't seen Hurricane's chief of police, her friend Carlton's father, since the night they escaped Freddy's together. Looking now at his withered face, she felt a rush of fear. Mr. Burke, Clay, what are you doing here? Charlie, do you have a second? He asked. Her heart sped up. Is Carlton okay? She asked urgently. Yes, he's fine, Burke assured her. Walk with me. Don't worry about being late. I'll give you a note for class. At least I think an officer of the law has authority to do that. He winked, but Charlie didn't smile. Something was wrong. Charlie followed him back down the stairs. When they were a dozen feet from the building, Burke stopped and met her gaze, as if he were looking for something. Charlie, we found a body, he said. I want you to take a look at it. You want me to look at it? I need you to see it. Me. She said the only thing she could. Why? Does it have to do with Freddy's? I don't want to tell you anything until you've seen it, Burke said. He started walking again, and Charlie hurried to keep up with his long stride. She followed him to the parking lot just outside the main gate, and got into his car without a word. Charlie settled into her seat, a strange dread stirring within her. Clay Burke glanced at her, and she gave a sharp, quick nod. He pulled the car out onto the road, and they headed back to Hurricane. And that is the end of Chapter 1. Thank you for listening to this chapter of Five Nights at Freddy's, The Twisted Ones. I really hope you enjoyed listening to it. If you did enjoy it, make sure you hit that like button. I really do appreciate it. And if you're new to this channel, please subscribe to get the next chapter of this novel. Also, make sure you click that bell so you'll be notified whenever I upload a new video. And I'll be back next week with the next chapter. Alright? See ya.